We are here tonight to celebrate the life, career, and legacy of the singular, I would say preeminent, American writer F. Scott Fitzgerald. I am so pleased and, if I may use a British word, chuffed, to now introduce his granddaughter, Cecilia Ross, who we are so glad could join us this evening. Thank you.
I'm going to introduce your panel, but notes here say introduce yourself and add a personal note. So, no, I did not inherit his talent for writing, but I cannot spell at all, and he could not spell at all either. My mother could spell, and I don't know why she could spell and then I can't spell. But my sister can spell, I can't spell. So that's the only thing I've inherited. And so, anyway, but also I'm the favorite grandchild, I think, even though I didn't know him. Okay, this Saturday will mark what would have been the 120th birthday of my grandfather. His literary works have made a huge impact across generations, spanning from classrooms to living rooms. I am thrilled to introduce this panel of esteemed writers, thinkers, and artists who will share more about his life and legacy. I would also like to acknowledge and thank the Robert and Ann Newburger Foundation, which made today's full-day event possible. The first panelist is Maureen Corrigan, and she is a book critic for NPR's Fresh Air, and I have to say that I kind of resent her because every time she reviews a book, I want to read it, and I don't have enough time. So sometimes it's really hard to listen to it because she does such a good job. Her compelling book, So We Read On, How the Great Gatsby Came to Be and Why It Endures, and I did really enjoy that book, encourages readers to rediscover the greatness of F. Scott Fitzgerald's enduring masterpiece. So thank you, Maureen, for coming here. Please don't try to sell a book to me. It's just, I have so many, I'm already behind schedule. Jackson Bryer I have known for many, many years, starting probably when I was a teenager, probably a brat, because he was always in our house for some reason. Well, I know why he was, because he became great friends with my mother and worked with her closely on doing some good scholarship and making sure that Fitzgerald's name was not sullied or bantered about in the wrong way. So we owe a lot to Jackson, and he's been a good friend to my sister and myself over the years as we go to the Fitzgerald Society gatherings, which I recommend everybody go to. And it's always a nice, friendly face seeing Jackson. And Jackson he was a professor emeritus of English at the University of Maryland, and he has been an author and contributor to scores of academic and critical works, including Dear Scott, Dearest Zelda, The Love Letters of F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald. His scholarship also led him to become acquainted with my mother, Frances Scott, Scotty Fitzgerald, the only child of F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald, and acquainted with us. And John Collins is the founder and artistic director of Elevator Repair Service, a New York-based experimental theater company. In 2010, after almost a decade of work, the company debuted Gatz, a 7-hour stage adaptation of The Great Gatsby at the New York's Off-Broadway Public Theater to great critical acclaim, and that is very true. I saw it when it was here in Philadelphia, and it was a fabulous performance, and it was really an interesting panel discussion already about how you came about to make some of those decisions. And I'm looking forward to going down to Washington and seeing, it's Hemingway's, right? Yeah, that'll be fun this winter. The panel will be moderated by University of Pennsylvania's literature professor, Rafael Walker. He specializes in American literature and has taught many seminars on The Great Gatsby. We are so pleased to have them here with us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Maureen Corrigan, Jackson Bryer, John Collins, and Rafael Walker to the Free Library.
First contacted by the library to do this, I was obviously very excited, Fitzgerald, yay. But I did have a nagging concern, which was that I couldn't think of a very firm connection to Philadelphia that Fitzgerald had. When I learned of Cecilia, I thought, There it is, right, there it is. Anyway, thank all of you so much for being here, for spending what I'm sure is preciously scarce free time here with us tonight. I know you could easily be elsewhere. And what I'll do before we get underway is just say a word about how this is going to go. So this event is scheduled to last for about an hour, the first 40 minutes of which we'll talk among ourselves here on the panel. And then for the last 20 minutes, we'll invite you to join the conversation with any questions about anything that has come up during the discussion or any topics that you're interested in but that we missed somehow in our discussion. So you'll be able to ask questions about any of that. With that, let's get underway here, and we'll start very, very big. Is that too loud? I guess I got too big. And this is a question that will, I think, drive at the heart of the Fitzgeraldian mystique here. And it's this. Of all classic American authors, I can think of no novelist who has been so broadly appealing as Fitzgerald. Beloved inside and outside of academia by specialists and lay readers alike, he has aged matchlessly. In your view, what features of his work, particularly The Great Gatsby, do you think explain his enduring allure? And John, I have you in mind in particular. How do we explain the fact that we were able to get audiences all over the country, and I think this even went abroad, right?
It did.
To sit through a reading of The Great Gatsby that lasted 7 hours, and some enjoyed it, it appeared, right? So maybe all of us can weigh in.
Well, I mean, I think that there are a bunch of different reasons why this story endures, which overlap with the reason the novel endures, but I would separate them in a way. It's a story that has become iconic, and characters that have become iconic, and it's such a beautiful telling of a particular part of American history, and it came to represent that part of American history and that age, and even beyond that, it came to represent aspects of what we think of as the American dream, and all of these ideas that are attached to it are part of the explanation. But when we did our production, where we became so intimately familiar with every word of the novel, I started to think there is really a different reason why The Great Gatsby endured the way it did, and it's because of the way it's written. For something that, I mean, my impression of that book growing up before I read it was that it must be a gigantic, thick novel. It must be thousands of pages, you know, The Great Gatsby, which I guess was not even F. Scott Fitzgerald's first choice of what to call it, but that's what he just had to go with when they went to press. But that title gives it this feeling of something gigantic, but the novel itself is so beautifully written, is such a perfect gem, almost a novella, that I came to think that that's the real reason, that writing, that language, when you read it, works its way into you in such a beautiful way that it almost silently works on you, which is a funny thing for me to say since we read it all out loud, but it's, I think ultimately, for all we associate with it, for all it has come to represent, I think it's just one of the greatest pieces of writing. And that's my answer.
Well, I think that I agree with everything John said about Gatsby, but I think a history lesson is in order here. When Fitzgerald died, Gatsby had sold 20,000 copies. There were still copies of the second printing in Scribner's warehouse. Most of the copies that had been sold in the last few years had been bought by Fitzgerald to give to friends. He was not totally out of print, but it wasn't that easy to find him in bookstores. Interestingly enough, when he died, newspapers all over the United States wrote appreciative editorials about him, which was very interesting because really he'd been out of the limelight since 1934 when Tender as the Night was published. But ironically, what he was remembered for was not Gatsby, but his novel, This Side of Paradise, which kind of introduced the, the jazz age and the young man's quest for not growing up or whatever. And it was not really until 1951 when Arthur Meisner published his biography of Fitzgerald, and Bud Schulberg published a novel called The Disenchanted that was based on his time with Fitzgerald, that Fitzgerald really came back. Now, Maureen writes very eloquently about how Gatsby was disseminated pretty widely to service people during World War II, but the 40s were not a time when Fitzgerald was ranked with the great American writers. And I think it's significant, and maybe I overemphasize this, because no one agrees with John Moore about the greatness of Gatsby and the reason for it, which is the writing. But I do think it's significant that it was his life that brought him back to prominence, and that you cannot underestimate the story of his life, the myths that have grown up about it, the relationship between him and Zelda, the life they led during a period. They both were in their 20s, in the 20s. Zelda was born in 1900, Scott in 1896, so their lives sort of echoed the life of the century. And so I think, for people who are not necessarily the kind of readers some of us are, their life story also captivated people. And then people began to look at the books. I'm not suggesting, Maureen's right, people were looking at Gatsby before 1951, but the real resurgence of interest began in the 50s, and now, all of us up here are great admirers of the Great Gatsby, but he did write other books and other stories, and there's a bit of a feeling among some of us that we really ought to look at other things too and appreciate the greatness of a writer. I once taught a Fitzgerald seminar, and we read Tender as the Night, we read Gatsby, we read This Side of Paradise, and then when it came to read a short story, I said to the students each year, I said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to take this big, thick book of his short stories, and we're going to put a finger in the book, and we're going to talk about that short story, whatever story it comes to. And it frequently was a story that no one knew anything about. I remember once it was The Baby Party, which is a wonderful story, but you never hear very much about it. And we spent the whole class talking about that story, and we found things in it that you wouldn't find in most writers. And it's one of the great sadnesses also among us that his Fitzgerald short stories, there are about 8 of them that are loved, and nobody knows anything about the other 140 of them. And somebody once said, not all of them are great stories, but there's something in almost every one of them that no one else could have written. So it's not just Gatsby. To you, Maureen.
It's not just Gatsby, but damn it, Gatsby is the greatest. I do think Gatsby is our greatest American and un-American novel at once. I think Gatsby is such a strange novel. One of the things Fitzgerald said about it is that it was about aspiration. And of course, I always think, as so many people do, of the first time you glimpse Gatsby in the novel. At the end of chapter 1, Nick sees Gatsby standing at the edge of his lawn, holding out his arms, of course, to that green light at the edge of Daisy's dock across the water. But that, I can't do it because I have the microphone in my hand, that yearning, that reaching, I think is so emblematic that that's what the novel is about. And yet at the same time, it's a novel that tells us he's doomed. This guy is dead already. When the novel opens, it's all Nick's remembering of that summer of 1922. Everything is closed. This is all looking backwards. So this is a novel about possibility and aspiration, very American. And at the same time, it's a novel that's saying the game is rigged. You never, you really can't be more than what you are starting out as James Gatz, because the past will pull you back again. And by the way, I just have to say, I saw Gatz twice. And my book started the night my husband and I saw Gatz in 2010. We lucked into 2 tickets which had been returned on Thanksgiving Eve of 2010. We took a Greyhound bus up from DC because we didn't want to drive, and we had to be back in DC for Thanksgiving the next day to have Thanksgiving dinner for everybody. We came out of that 7.5 hours in the theater. I didn't stop talking until I think we got to Towson, Maryland on the bus back at 3:30 in the morning. And my husband said, "This is the book you have to write." And I thought, why? There's been so many books, including Jackson's magnificent books. But you know what? I think there could be 100 more books about Fitzgerald, and we wouldn't exhaust him.
And, you know, you probably with me detect a little bit of tension here on the panel, and I want to exploit that for a moment. We've got Maureen, who's clearly Team Gatsby, and Jackson is telling us we need to read more widely. And so I want to ask, why do you think that the rest of his work has failed to strike the chord with today's audience that Gatsby did? And another way of putting the question is, what do you think Fitzgerald's reputation today would be had another work, say Tender as the Night, come down to us as his signature novel?
Well, you can't underestimate the fact that Gatsby is 165 pages long. And, you know, as someone who, up until a few years ago, taught college students, and some of you teach high school students, you know. Now, I mean, its brevity is one of its great virtues. I mean, it's not just a short book. I mean, English teachers, maybe Maureen feels exempted from this, but I think English teachers are preternaturally resistant to fads, you know, and feeling that the only reason to read this writer is because of this book. I mean, one of the other writers I'm very fond of is Eugene O'Neill, and, you know, everybody talks about a few plays, and there are a lot of plays. And I'd like to think that people could explore the other books. On the other hand, and now I seem to be changing teams, there is no book you can teach more fruitfully than The Great Gatsby. I mean, you and I were talking about this in the green room. You can read The Great Gatsby the way you read a poem. The reason John couldn't not do the whole book is that if you take one sentence out of it, a sentence someplace else in the book makes no sense. It's like an experience I once had advising somebody to do a television adaptation of a Lillian Hellman play, and they said, well, we only have an hour and a half, so you've got to cut something out of this play. And, you know, I started to do it, and I realized if I cut something here, something later. That's true of Gatsby. I mean, you know, what was Fitzgerald's phrase? I want to write something intricately patterned. And there's no better text to teach students than a book like that, because it's all about the writing. It's all about the style. And if you can get students, as we all know, to pay attention to what's on the page, rather than thinking about extra literary things, you know. I mean, I'm not against cultural backgrounds that you and I talked about, but if you can get them to see that what makes such beautiful writing, that will make great readers of them from then on, because they'll know the difference between great writing and mediocre writing. And that's the business we as teachers are in, is to make them see why, you know, Danielle Steele isn't as good as F. Scott Fitzgerald. And
Says who?
More tension.
yeah, right.
I want to build.
So I am changing teams to that extent.
We can forgive you that, Jackson. Well, I want to press that, though, a little bit further, because there's something more.
Stop picking on me, Rafael.
You know, it's a panel. This there's got to be more than simply his style that is leading to the fan culture that he has. I mean, it's not style that's leading to these flapper parties and so forth that we see happening all over the place. So I want to ask about Fitzgerald fan culture, if we can switch lanes a bit here. So to find fan cultures as vibrant as Fitzgerald, we would really have to look beyond the American canon, right? We might look at certain British authors. I mean, you know, Melville, he's great, but he doesn't have it.
Well, there is a Hemingway lookalike contest in Key West every year. Come on.
Yeah, sure, but there are not 50 Hemingway movies. You know, it's just not right. It's not happening for him, unfortunately.
What about the Stella shouting contest in New Orleans every year? Come on, there's a lot of this stuff.
But there's nothing quite like Fitzgerald. You'll grant me that, yeah? For the sake of
I
argument.
grant you that the costumes and the dressing up and the let's that's also I don't mean to denigrate it, but that's also an easy thing to do. Like if you're going if you're going to celebrate a novel, and since every chapter in this novel is organized around a party of sorts, and I'm using that term loosely, but it's one of the strange things about the novel, including the failed party at the end of Gatsby's funeral, not Fitzgerald's, although they have a lot in common, right? Then it's easy to sort of, work up enthusiasm for the novel by saying, let's have a dress-up party, and, everybody wear these fabulous clothes.
Sure. I think maybe it caused us to sort of fetishize the dress-up party part, but that really isn't the heart of the question for me. It's this. How would you describe Fitzgerald fan culture? Right? What's distinctive about Fitzgerald fan culture that's different from, say, Austen or Shakespeare fan culture, both of whom have extremely devout, somewhat fanatical followers, right? They dress up like Elizabeth Bennet and do country dance parties.
Well, it's a very his books are really about, Maureen said it, they're really about aspiration. They're really about wanting to make it and realizing how difficult it is to make it. And that's very American. We're experiencing it now. And I think that's part of it. The other thing, and again, I'm playing on the other team now, every time you read Gatsby at a different point in your life, it's a different book for you. Mm-hmm. And you take something different from it each time based on the generation you're in, based on the generation you're reading it in. And that is a very unusual thing for a novel. There are others like that. Certainly Shakespeare's plays are like that. But I'm sure you experienced that with Gatz, didn't you?
We did. People would often come dressed up to see the show, and then they might be disappointed that we don't dress up that way in the show. I wonder if some of it is this, because what we discovered about the book was, I think, something was much more timeless, and I often, in talking about what we did, resist the idea of the sort of 20s culture around it. But I do think there's something about that time that people project. It was, in some ways, a kind of innocence that never came back. Before World War II, this feeling that there had been the Great War and that would never happen again, and this exuberance that people needed something to project that onto, and that sense of aspiration, and not just in The Great Gatsby or the other novels, but in the story of his life, that there was aspiration and romance and struggle, and that there was something tragic there too. That seems like such an ideal vessel. It's a coincidence in a way of when he lived that people may want to attach. They need a figure to attach that hope and aspiration and innocence to, that may contribute to that sense of that fan culture, or that obsessiveness.
He caught something. He caught something that is in all of us. I mean, I often say that you find out all you have to know about Fitzgerald by going to St. Paul and seeing where he grew up and realizing he grew up in a very, very modest little apartment building right across the street from the backyards of the wealthiest people in St. Paul. And he desperately wanted to be part of that world. He was part of it, but he wasn't. And I think the complicated part of it, and this gets to what John is talking about that is universal about it, at the same time as he wanted to be part of it, he had great disdain for it. And the two things working together is something that is very, very human. And I think people catch that, and he caught that. I said to Rafael in the green room that you can read Gatsby as a fool, Jay Gatsby, an absolute fool, a deluded man who never understood the situation. Or you can read him as a romantic hero. And a lot of it depends on who you are and when you're reading it and what the context is. And the book changes, in a way, the way you change, as I said earlier, and the way the times change. It's a little bit like the Don Quixote story. I mean, the impossible dream idea. And that he caught something. He caught something that we can identify with all these years later. And of course, there's romance too, and that there's a girl, and and there's a guy, and Gatsby and all of his books, really, many of his stories are about a boy and a girl, and the boy usually is a poor boy who's in love with a rich girl, and the rich girl desperately wants the poor boy, but she can't because he's not the right person for her. As a character says in The Side of Paradise, I'm going to marry so-and-so because he's my kind of thing. Well, that's Tom Buchanan and Daisy Buchanan. And I remember the first time I read Gatsby, I fully expected Gatsby and Daisy to end up together at the end. I was about 14, and I thought this is the most romantic story I've ever read, and they're going to end up together. And then, of course, they didn't. And now, if I read it at 50, I would never expect them to end up together because I'm a different person. But you can read it as a romantic story, too, still.
I think you'll have to read more Danielle Steele. I think that's what this is all pointing to. Okay, so let's switch gears just a bit. Great answers. I think one of the things that's coming out of that is there's something about the time that he's writing about that's drawing these fans in. I think that's a great answer. But let's talk about the film, the most recent 2013 film. Many of us have seen it, some in 3D, right? That option was available to us. What's your take on the film? And relatedly, and John, you certainly will have a good deal to say about this, what do you think are some of the main challenges facing anyone who seeks to put that novel, Great Gatsby, in a different medium?
Okay. Well, for what we did, I sort of conceded the loss from the beginning by saying we're going to make a play around this novel, but I really just want the novel to be there on stage and still be the novel. So in a certain sense, I didn't dare adapt it, or to whatever extent our staging of it started to become an adaptation of it. I always wanted it to fall away. I always wanted it to just go back to being someone enchanted by this novel. And so in that sense, I think I dodged that assignment to some degree.
Oh, but you didn't. At any moment, right, when we change mediums, we inherently have
of course. And even the act of, even if we hadn't staged anything, just speaking it out loud is a very different way to hear it. I saw the movie twice. Both times I had some official reason for needing to go see it.
This is
the 2013, yeah. Oh, yeah. Are we talking about all the movies? Oh, okay. Talking about the Baz Luhrmann one. Yeah, Baz Luhrmann had come to see our play and had been very generous in talking about it when he gave interviews about his movie. Whenever they would ask him, like, well, how did you decide to what to keep and what to cut. And he said, well, we knew we had to cut something because, we found out how long it takes to do the whole thing when we saw that play. I mean, he was very kind about it. So
Did he stay the whole time?
he did. And Tobey Maguire did too, but Leonardo DiCaprio only made it through half. Oh, well. It's interesting, from the point of view of Fitzgerald's life, in that one thing he was striving for towards the end of his life was to get involved in Hollywood, and that Hollywood was this a kind of elusive dream of his to some extent. So it's interesting to think about his novel, becoming, in the case of Baz Luhrmann's movie, this very, glittery Hollywood, sort of a cinematic masterpiece. And I think there were some things that I was very touched by about the movie that seemed to get right in a lot of ways. There were things about the way it was cast that I thought made a lot of sense, really resonated. I'll just say it, I had real problems with some other choices that he made. And I'll just say the one that I think got me the most was the decision to have Nick become a recovering alcoholic. And we were talking in our talk earlier today about how a subtle shift of a single word can really change the meaning of what Fitzgerald created. And in chapter 2 of the novel, Nick is getting drunk with Tom and Myrtle and their friends in that apartment, and he says, I have been drunk just twice in my life, and the second time was that afternoon. In other words, he's telling us that an important thing to know about him is that that was the last time he ever got drunk. And that quality of Nick, of being in the middle of everything and being a little bit outside of everything all at the same time, I think is sort of summed up in the fact that he doesn't get drawn into becoming a drunk. He doesn't succumb. And that is one of the most interesting things about the novel, the way he places that narrator, sometimes right in the middle of things, sometimes intentionally or otherwise orchestrating what happens, and then removing himself. So I was surprised that, as a way of justifying the voiceover narration, he had Nick a recovering alcoholic. And it's an interesting thing, because what he was doing was solving a cinematic problem. He needed a reason for the voiceover, which is the reason that he said he did that. But it's a hard thing to do. Anyway, and what I think sometimes happens with the movies and all these adaptations is that they get seduced. The filmmakers get seduced the same way Gatsby's party guests do. They want it to be about the amazing parties, 3D, flappers coming at you in 3D. That's the point of view of those people who don't know Gatsby. That's the point of view of the people who know Gatsby as a myth. He's a bootlegger. I hear he killed somebody once, And I think it's very easy to get seduced in that same way when you're turning it into a film.
One of them, I didn't like the film, and one of the things I didn't like about it was Leonardo DiCaprio's performance. I felt that he was too self-assured, and one of the things I loved about Gatz was, forgive me, the actor who played
Jim
Scott.
Fletcher.
Yeah.
Or Jim Fletcher played Gatsby.
Jim Fletcher, yeah.
Scott played Nick.
Scott played Nick. Yeah.
Jim Fletcher looked so uncomfortable in his own skin, which is who Gatsby is. He's uncomfortable in his own skin. He's trying too hard. He's always overdoing it. And boy, that quality of the novel speaks to what Jackson was talking about. Somebody who wants to be in that world desperately, but the folks who have the old money, like the Buchanans, they can sniff out that this guy, Gatsby, isn't quite one of us. The other thing that irritated me so much about the movie was that Luhrmann left out the most important line about Daisy. Her voice is full of money. Why leave that line out? I mean, this is I think our greatest novel about class in America. Why leave that line out?
I actually liked the movie, but No, because I didn't regard it as the book. I regarded it as a movie. And it's interesting, we had a Fitzgerald conference in Montgomery, Alabama, not too long after the movie came out. And in this room of 40 people, all of whom were, quote, Fitzgerald scholars, everybody seemed to like the movie. And I raised my hand and I said, this is phenomenal. I mean, here is a room full of people who know all this stuff about Fitzgerald, and here's a movie that lasted about 20 minutes in movie theaters in the United States and was broadly panned, and you all like it. Actually, what I liked about it was a very strange thing. I'd probably been teaching that book for 45 years when I saw the Baz Luhrmann version. I probably read it that many times, if not more. And there was a review of the movie in the New York Times that said, roughly, this is a fable, and Baz Luhrmann treated it as a fable. And honestly, I had never, ever thought of that before, and in a way, it is. That's not to say it doesn't have all the qualities that we've been talking about of being real, but there is another way in which it's a fantastic fable. And Baz Luhrmann made it that way. Now, he made it his fantastic fable. I agree with everything that is being said. Apropos of what John said, it's a strange mixture of a man who obviously had done a lot of research and then decided to do what he wanted to do. Because there are lots of points in the movie where if you're a Fitzgerald insider, you understand things that most people wouldn't understand that he clearly did understand. Like the music that's played at Gatsby's party, he had Rhapsody in Blue playing at that party. Well, that scene is based on the moment in history when Paul Whiteman's orchestra played Rhapsody in Blue at, Tostov's famous symphony is based on the real Rhapsody in Blue. So he knew what he was doing. The moment in the movie when you see the white chauffeur with the black passengers, there's nothing said in the movie. He didn't use the line where Nick said, "Now I knew anything was possible." He just assumed that you knew when you saw that scene that you knew what was so remarkable about it. So there are lots of indications that he'd done his homework, but then, as John said, there are a lot of other indications that he simply decided, as a filmmaker is wont to do, and is perfectly privileged to do, he decided he wanted to do what he wanted to do with it. And, I went prepared to hate it. Just as I went to Gatz saying, I don't know whether I'm going to enjoy this a lot. And in both cases, which were very, very different, I like them both. And I think that's a testimony to the richness of the original work, by the way. Maybe. That you can do so much with it in so many different mediums and still have it appeal to people.
Yeah. I mean, I should add, I am really the worst possible person to ask that question of, because I have become so attached to the exact sequence of words that is The Great Gatsby, that every time in the movie, and as you say, he did his homework and he used a lot of the text verbatim, but he'd go along and I'd feel myself sort of carry along and then like, different word. Like it was so jarring to me, but I don't think that happens to most people. And and I missed chapter 9 so much, but the book concludes with a long meditation on the discovery of the New World, and he talks about Long Island and what it must have seemed like to the early settlers, and this is my favorite language in the book, which doesn't really work for a movie. You can't. At least maybe that's the assumption, is that you can't linger in that moment that way in a movie that lasts an hour and 45 minutes or whatever. So he had to lose it. But instead what we get is in the movie saying, and while I sat there musing on the old unknown world, after he just hasn't been musing on the old unknown world, for someone like me who's got a sort of obsession, I'm the worst person to send to that movie.
Well, and the other thing is that, the parties at Gatsby's house in 1925, if we put them on the screen now as they were in 1925, it would be a quaint little block party that everybody has once a week. So you have to do something over the top. And that's what he did. He did something completely over the top. And, you know, I was mostly irritated by those cars on the road, which look like bumper cars. But again, it's a fable. I mean, it's not, you know, it's not really, in a very strange sense, it's not really happening, and yet it is really happening. Because don't forget, and you talked a little bit about this earlier when we were talking before, how reliable is Nick? You know, who knows? You know, this is all Nick's account. And isn't he perhaps romanticizing this story, fabulizing this story beyond what it really was? And he is a character. He's not the author. He's a designed person. And who knows? I mean, if I had Fitzgerald here now, the one question I would have loved to have asked him is, what was your purpose in having Nick be the narrator of this novel? What made, I mean, he based it on Conrad and the whole idea of a second narrator, but he must have had a purpose, and I would love to know. Wouldn't you love to know that?
I think I'd ask him the more worshipful question. How did you do it? How did you do it?
Well, he wouldn't have the answer to that.
No, I love what an old student of mine said about Gatsby one day. He came into my office and he wanted to talk about Gatsby. And he said, it's the Sistine Chapel of literature in 180 pages. And I said, I'm going to use that, okay? And he said, yeah, it's okay. But, you know, like, how do you do that? Because I am obsessed with Gatsby, but we in my Fitzgerald course at Georgetown, we just finished This Side of Paradise, which I'm happy to say the students always love. They kind of connect with it in some way. We read the short stories, the letters, the crack-up essays, brilliant. But how do you do this? I mean, you read This Side of Paradise, The Beautiful and Damned, even Tender is the Night. This is something else.
Yeah, and it is kind of remarkable, and again, I seem to be contradicting myself, that at one point he wrote this absolutely perfect novel, and he never again, either before and never again, really wrote anything quite like it. I mean, there are moments in Tender is the Night that are wonderful moments. Now, that novel went through a 9-year gestation process and was rewritten 4 or 5 times, so that's part of it. But, you know, it's amazing that after, I mean, Beautiful and Damned is a terrible novel, and I wouldn't want to inflict it on anybody. And, you know, 2 years later, he writes The Great Gatsby. I mean, I don't want to know. I just love the fact that it could happen. Should give hope to every nascent novelist all throughout the world.
Yeah. And they should all wish for an editor like Maxwell Perkins.
So we'll shift gears a bit. I think I have time maybe for 1 or 2 more questions before I invite our audience here, to a patient audience here, to join us. And this question takes a little bit of a build-up, and I will warn you in advance, it's controversial. But what Fitzgerald panel would be complete without a dash of drama? I think he'd like that. Though he probably wouldn't like this question very much, but I'm going to pose it anyway. So in the last 2 decades, Fitzgerald scholars have done much to bring to light the racist and nativist overtones of his work, especially Gatsby. Yet these findings do not appear to have exerted much of an influence on the ways that he's taught in the classroom outside of the university in particular. Yeah. I've had in my classes diehard Fitzgerald fans, many of whom had studied the novel 1, 2, 3, one person even 6 times, but who were shocked to learn, for example, of the problematic Jewishness of Meyer Wolfsheim and the racially charged descriptions of Gatsby. What do you think would happen if these less flattering aspects of Fitzgerald's revered work were regularly broached in English classrooms in high schools? They're afraid, right?
in high school, I think you'd have great discussions. I mean, I don't think that, you know, when I say I think this is our greatest American novel, it doesn't mean that, as worshipful as I am, that all you do is worship. You know, and I think high schools, I think those kids are ready for it. They've had, you know, years already of sort of talking about things in terms of race, if not so much class, but certainly in terms of race, and the anti-Semitism in the novel. I mean, he may as well hit you over the head with it with a club. I mean, Meyer Wolfsheim, who has his molar cufflinks. I mean, presumably, if you don't pay him on time, he's a money lender like Shylock. He yanks your teeth out. He gets his pound of flesh, right? So it's all there. It's a novel of its time, and it's got the prejudices of its time. And its author had the prejudices of his time. And then, like all great works of art do, I'll use the word that's not hip in the Academy, it also transcends its time. So it's both, I think. And I don't think that this novel would come away as some kind of mangled thing if we insisted that students look at those passages. Look at the passage that you mentioned, Jackson. I mean, that Queensboro Bridge passage where you've got the white chauffeur driving two bucks and a girl. I mean, that's the description. That's the language of the novel, the African-American passengers. I mean, that's a very anxious passage about the two white guys, Nick and Gatsby, being passed on the road, the Queensboro Bridge, by people of color, and then who comes after them? Immigrants from southeastern Europe who are in a funeral cortege. They're all passing. I mean, think about the symbolism of that. They're zooming past the two white guys as they go over Blackwell's Island, which is now Roosevelt Island. But Blackwell's Island back then, when Fitzgerald was writing, was not a place you would want to linger or certainly build a condo on. It had a mental institution, prison. I mean, this is a sinister image, and it's a passage that speaks to the nervousness of white people at the time about immigration and also about people of color. I mean, this is the age of, you know, the Great Migration too. So there's a lot of worry about who's pouring into New York, especially at this time.
Yeah, I urge you all to read an op-ed piece in the New York Times this morning by a writer whose last name is Vance. I think it's D.C. Vance. CD uses initials, and it's all to the point, using today's politics as the launching point, that anybody on the left or right who doesn't acknowledge a racial problem in this country is blind. And what Maureen says is right. There was just as much a racial problem in the 20s, and to have not acknowledged it would have been probably more of one, obviously. But, you know, the reason the book speaks to us today, among many other reasons, is we're still, I mean, you know, Tom Buchanan talking about the racial superiority of the Aryan race. Come on, we're having that in today's election. And, you know, we're having the same conversation that Tom Buchanan had now. You know, people are on different sides, and you can parse it any way you want. But it's a part of our society, just as it was a part of that society. And Fitzgerald, I mean, I don't know whether Fitzgerald included it because it was, you know, there was a great deal of anti-Semitism and racial prejudice that was kind of accepted in the 20s that is no longer accepted in quite the same way. And I don't know whether Fitzgerald's inclusion of it is for that reason or not. But one of the things that makes it a very modern novel is that that is present today. The other thing I mentioned to you earlier is there is another way of reading this novel, and I think you mentioned it. You know, there was a whole series of people writing letters and things that pictured Gatsby as the other, and Gatsby as a potential other. and that he is the other in the novel.
I'll just add from my own experience of this, you know, I think reading the novel the way you read a book quietly, silently to yourself, is a very different experience than actually taking those words and speaking them aloud in front of a lot of people. And that caused us to have to confront these things about the novel in a very different way. It's a very different experience to read it and then discuss it. It's still it's sort of a separate object from you. It can feel attached to its time in a different way, but when these 13 actors walk on stage and say these things and utter them out loud, it was a very scary thing for us to do because it brought those things into really stark relief. Because we were owning those words in a way that you don't have to when you just read. And so it felt very risky to us, and that felt very close, those problems. And so we knew we were taking a risk in doing that because we would be giving voice to those things that are much more difficult to hear now. And so I think it's a testament to the novel in a larger way that it can actually survive itself like that.
Did you get any response to that aspect of the novel from audiences?
I think occasionally people would note it, but there's a sort of, but I think because they understood that we were just reading the novel as it was, you know, that we would, in a certain sense, we could shirk some responsibility almost for that, but at the same time feel very responsible for embodying that. It's a different thing to say it out loud.
Yeah, I mean, it was very interesting that Luhrmann chose to make Wolfsheim a Pakistani, I guess, Indian or Pakistani character. That was very interesting.
Hi, thanks very much for sharing your conversation with us. It was fascinating. I have a question that is really embarrassing. And that is, I've read the book many times, but if I put aside the fact that it is gorgeous, I have no idea what the book is about and what I'm supposed to take from it. I know that Gatsby believed in the green light, but does that mean I'm not supposed to aspire to anything or that any aspiration is doomed? What does the book mean?
It means whatever you want it to mean. No, seriously, these characters never existed. The book is about you. The book is about what it says to you. I think, you know, what it means to Maureen, what it means to John, what it means to me could be completely different. I think what it means to me, okay, I'll tell you what I think it means to me. It's the ambivalence that exists between the romantic dream and the practicalities of life. In other words, you know, it's the same conflict that exists in Streetcar Named Desire, and Tennessee Williams was a great admirer of Fitzgerald. You know, is Blanche right or is Stanley right? Blanche is right if you're a humanities major. Stanley is right if you're a lawyer and an engineer, and they're both equally right. I mean, you know, I was telling Rafael, I once talked about Gatsby in a public school in Annapolis, Maryland, and 5 of the students were all totally under the thrall of Gatsby, and the 6th guy, who was by far the brightest person in the room, hated Gatsby and thought he was the worst person ever. And I never said a word. They just went at each other about it, and they were both absolutely eloquent. So I don't want to tell you what it means.
Jackson, I winced when you said it means whatever you want it to mean, because I imagine saying that to a class and that you've lost it. I mean, that, you know, it means whatever you want it to mean as long as you pay attention to the words.
I don't mean that it can be about World War III. I mean.
But you know, I keep coming back to how odd this novel is, and it's so over-designed. I mean, we all know how the symbol patterns in this novel are 9 miles thick, and yet it reads so easily, so lyrically, that you can ignore those symbol patterns for the most part. One of the designs in the novel is that everybody is reaching for someone or something that they will never grasp, except maybe Daisy. She's the sun in the middle, and she doesn't seem to be reaching. And And that, again, I come back to that image of Gatsby reaching out his arms. Everybody's aspiring, reaching, yearning. And I think the novel basically reaffirms that our time on earth is limited. We're all going to die. But we've got to try anyway. You know, that's the doubleness at the end. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past, which, by the way, everybody, the 2 times I saw Gatz, after 7.5 hours, everybody chanted those lines together at the end. It was quite a moment. But it's both. We know we're doomed, and yet we have to try.
I think there's something in it that is, and I think this conforms to what you both have said, because I agree. There's no way to, if a great work of art of any kind can't ever accept a single meaning. But to me, there is something about and something to aspire to almost, not in Gatsby, but in Nick, that he presents for you to aspire to, which is the ability to observe contradicting truths and ambiguities and not judge, and see beauty in that. And I think, you know, he concludes with that incredibly beautiful line, which is just an undeniably lyrically beautiful thing to say, but it's a description of trying to go that way and ending up going that way instead, which is, you know, to find beauty in that, which is what, Nick represents in his observation, and to find the beauty in just a non-judgmental observation. I mean, Nick himself can't quite get there, but that's what he's describing as an observation. I mean, that to me is very near the heart of the novel.
You know, one of the signature events of the 1920s is America's angry rejection of the first serious Catholic presidential candidate, Al Smith. He's seen as an alien, you know, too urban, too wet. The diction and the speech, it's just all wrong. So when I think about that, I think about the fact that it can't have been a very easy time to be Irish and Catholic, which leads me to ask if Fitzgerald was just an author who happened to be Catholic or should be considered in some sense as a Catholic writer.
Well, that was one of the ways he was an outsider. I mean, growing up in St. Paul, he was very aware not only of the social, I mean, his family, his mother's family, actually had quite a bit of money for that time. And he was very much aware that as the son of an Irish Catholic family, he never could be part of the St. Paul social establishment. So I do think, and there are some wonderful remarks that he made in a famous letter to John O'Hara at the end of his life about that, about his feeling of inadequacy. And of course, O'Hara was Irish, and so they shared that. So I do think that's one of the several ways in which he felt like an outsider. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah. You know, there are many dissertations written about Gatsby, the Catholic element in Gatsby. Maybe they're all at Georgetown where I teach, but there have been a lot of dissertations written about it. And as everybody up here knows, and I'm sure many people in the audience, Fitzgerald writes to Perkins early on and says that his new novel, what is this, 1920, I think it's even earlier than 22, that his new novel, it's going to be set in the Midwest, and it's going to deal with Catholic themes. And what we've got of that early Gatsby is a short story called Absolution, in which a young boy is making a confession to a priest who's obviously having some kind of a breakdown. So he's playing with,
that was supposed to
drawing
be
on his background.
That was supposed to be the opening chapter of Gatsby. And I urge you to read that story because Rudolph Miller in that story is in many ways, as Maureen says, a kind of Gatsby figure. And that background he obviously did away with before he wrote the novel, but it's there.
Thank you very much for this wonderful, fascinating discussion. I read several of Fitzgerald's essays and articles for magazines, and some of them struck to me as incredibly contemporary. Like he writes about raising children, dual career families, roles of women. It was just unbelievable. It seemed to me like I was reading op-ed in New York Times. So my question is about his nonfiction and what it means for the panel in your fascination with Scott Fitzgerald, and do you also find his nonfictional writing contemporary?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, thank you for bringing that up. I mean, he wrote some more. I mean, one of the other myths about Fitzgerald, which is not a myth, it's an actual thing, but it's overestimated, is, you know, he couldn't have been a very good writer because everything he did was to make money in order to support his lifestyle, and that therefore he wrote these essays and these short stories in 20 minutes in order to make enough money to keep his advance from Scribner's under control. Yeah, some of his essays are wonderful. They're funny, they're prescient, they're beautifully written. Again, his 3 essays that he wrote in 1936 called The Crack-Up, which are all about his own breakdown, are given much too much emphasis. I mean, they're wonderful essays, but there's a whole book of his essays that Jim West has edited for the Cambridge edition, which is almost now like a matter of fact, Scribner's has, I think, issued it in a paperback as a kind of autobiography, and it's marvelous. I recommend it to anybody.
And he wrote one of the greatest essays about New York, My Lost City. Yeah. That's, you know, just right up there with anything anybody else has ever written about New York.
Thank you all very much.
Would
Considering,
you please
my name is Susan,
Thank you.
and considering that Gatsby didn't get the kind of acclaim that he thought it deserved, wasn't he really frustrated that his masterpiece was kind of
Well, writers always think that the last book they wrote is their best. Yes, he was frustrated. One of the last letters he wrote to Perkins said, it was just at the beginning of the, I mean, it's very ironic in terms of what Maureen is talking about, but one of the last letters he wrote to Perkins was right at the time paperback books were becoming, you know, sort of the thing. And he said something like, will the 25-cent market be the thing for Gatsby?
Bring it back.
Bring
Yeah,
it back.
bring it
And
back.
of course, as Maureen has done so beautifully in her book, she points out that the copies of Gatsby that were distributed to service people during the Second World War in paperback for nothing, I guess, was one of the major ways that Gatsby did come back. Yeah, he was frustrated, but he, you know, he was just as frustrated that Tender as the Night hadn't done very well in 1934. I don't know. What do you think? I don't know that he necessarily regarded Gatsby as his masterpiece. Do you?
I think about that letter to Perkins. That's 6 months before he died. And that letter haunts me because he says at the end of that letter something like, but to die, you know, without, you can't not quote Fitzgerald perfectly. You might as well give up if you can't remember the exact words. But he says, even now there's little in American literature that doesn't bear my stamp. It's a wonderful and heartbreaking letter because he knows what he did. He knows what he's got. And his work hadn't reached its audience yet. That's, you know, that's kind of the heartbreak, I think, of Fitzgerald. Here we all are talking about him, and he's being read all over the world and taught, and
yeah, one of the contextual things you have to remember about Fitzgerald is that during the 30s, his work was very much out of favor because he wasn't writing about the Depression. He was writing about rich people on the Riviera, and he was writing about rich people in America. And one of the famous reviews of Tender as the Night appeared in the Daily Worker, of all places, and the headline was, "You can't hide from a hurricane under a beach umbrella." And that haunted him because, you know, during the 30s, everybody was writing proletarian novels about the time, and he was in many ways bucking that tide.
Okay, it is really, I guess I'm protesting this, but I'm told that we have to call things to a close, and we could talk about Fitzgerald all night had we whirled in time, but we don't. We have to be out of here at 9. So this is our panel. Please join me in giving them a round of applause.